Good afternoon. Welcome to a special medical grand rounds, and special in part because of our speaker and in part because it is a joint grand rounds between the Department of Medicine and the Department of Pediatrics. Sandrine von Schaik, the vice chair, is with us as well, representing the department, but I will go ahead and do the introduction, and we're thrilled to do this together. For those of you who come for COVID content, we changed the schedule around a little bit, and next week we will do a COVID session. It will be a fireside chat with Eric Topol, who is at the Scripps Clinic, has been one of the leading thinkers and speakers on issues that relate to COVID. And following Eric on Twitter is actually a great pleasure because Eric annotates all of the emerging literatures that comes out. So we'll be here with Eric next Thursday. Eric's also a proud graduate of our medicine residency program. Today, let me just go ahead and give you the ground rules. You probably know them by now. Put your Zoom screen in full screen window. If you have questions, type them in the Q&A box. We'll try to get to as many as we can. The session, as always, will be recorded and will be available that website later. We'll also tweet it out, probably go up in a couple of 2-3 days, probably early next week. Closed captioning is available, and if you're interested in CME credit, it is available. Stay on at the very end, and we will tell you how to get to the website, or you can use the QR code to do that. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Today's speaker that we're thrilled to have with us is Dr. Kamara Phyllis Jones. Kamara is a family physician, epidemiologist, past president of the American Public Health Association. Her work now for decades has focused on naming, measuring, and addressing the impacts of racism on the health and well-being of our country and the world. We're particularly pleased because she is a UCSF person this year. She is currently the 2021 to 2022 UCSF Presidential Chair. This is a program by which we bring in world-leading experts who hang out with us for a year, and part of it is them learning, but a lot of it is them teaching us, and in this case, this is clearly no exception. She's done a few of these. She recently completed a role as Presidential Visiting Fellow at Yale, and before that was at the Center for Advanced Study at Harvard. So that seems like a nice way of living one's life, doing presidential chairs. In her prior lives, she served on the faculty at the Harvard School of Public Health, and for 14 years was a medical officer at the CDC, and she's actually in Atlanta today. She's currently an adjunct professor at the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory, and senior fellow and adjunct associate professor at the Morehouse School of Medicine. Her talk today is entitled Confronting Racism Denial, Naming Racism, and Moving to Action. So Kamara, thank you for being here today, and thank you for being here this year.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wachter and Dr. von Schaik. And I am delighted to be here. I am learning so much, as you said. It's definitely a two-way street. I am also delighted to be invited to spark a conversation, an ongoing conversation, I hope, on confronting racism denial, naming racism, and moving to action. And sometimes I can speak so deeply into my slides, but I'm going to have to be very tight so that we have time for interaction at the end of these grand rounds. I have no relevant financial relationships to disclose. And when in 2016, which is now 6 years ago, I was president of the American Public Health Association, I took that platform, that opportunity to launch our association, and as many other medical associations and public health associations and communities as would join us on a national campaign against racism with 3 tasks. The first, to name racism, to say the whole word, racism, because racism denial is huge. It's like a huge black hole in our national landscape, like black holes in the universe. Black holes in the universe are massive and they suck things into them, but you can't see them. And the reason you can't see them is that even when light gets near, the light gets sucked in. Well, in our national landscape, as we move as a nation to thinking about racism, I've come to understand that in our work on anti-racism, confronting racism denial is a huge endeavor. We're even seeing that in some of the discourse about what happened a year ago today. in our nation. So we have to name racism, but then naming racism, documenting the impacts of racism on the health and well-being of the nation, that's all well and good, but we must move to action. So the second of the three tasks is to ask the question, how is racism operating here? To identify levers for intervention, targets for action, and then we need to organize and strategize to act, because yes, we can act as individuals, that's important, but collective action is where the real power is. So I aim during these few minutes to give you tools to do each of those three tasks: to name racism, to ask how is racism operating here, and then at least the impetus, but maybe a little bit of tool to organize and strategize to act. There are four key messages when naming racism. The first is that racism exists. The second is that racism is a system. The third is that racism saps the strength of the whole society. And the fourth is that, yes, we can act to dismantle racism. Now, it just occurred to me that I just launched in talking about racism, and you guys are in medical and pediatric grand rounds, and you're like, well, who is this, right? Even though you heard I'm a family physician, PhD epidemiologist and all. And so I just hope that you will also, by the end of these grand rounds, be convinced that anti-racism is a legitimate medical intervention. If I don't do anything else, I hope that you have that sense, not only that it's legitimate, but that there's some part in it where you can act, that you have entree into being anti-racism. The first tool I'm going to give you is one of my allegories based on something that happened in my own real life. Most of my allegories, my teaching stories are like that. This one I call Dual Reality, a restaurant saga. And this helps people understand and communicate with others about that first of the four key messages, that racism exists. So step into my shoes. I was many decades ago, a first-year medical student. And on this given Saturday, like most, I had awakened early. I was studying, nose in the books, got to be mid-afternoon. Some of my friends came over, and did they distract me from my studies? Oh, no. No, we all got to studying long and hard together. And now it was getting late. We were getting hungry, and I had no food in the apartment, which was so typical of me that my friends understood. And they said, okay, Kamara, we got that, but we're hungry. So we need to go into town and find something to eat. So we do. So we walk into town, we find a restaurant, we walk in and we sit down. The menus are presented and we order our food, and the food is served, and here we are eating. So maybe not the story about racism in a restaurant that you thought I might tell, or at least people of my generation might have thought I would tell. But hold on. As I sat there with my friends eating, I looked across the room and I noticed a sign that was a startling revelation about racism. So now I've intrigued you, and you're wondering, Dr. Jones, what did the sign say? Oh, well, what did the sign say? The sign said open. So now maybe I've lost most of you, because how is that a startling revelation about racism? Well, here I am, let me recap. Here I am sitting in a restaurant eating. I look across the room, I see a sign that says open, thinking no more about it. I would assume that other hungry people could walk in, sit down, order their food and eat. But because I knew something about the two-sided nature of those signs, I recognized that indeed now the restaurant was closed due to the hour, but firmly closed, and that other hungry people just a few feet away from me, but on the other side of that sign, would not be able to come in, sit down, order their food and eat. And that's when I recognized that racism structures open, closed signs in our society. That racism structures, if you will, a dual reality. And for those who are sitting inside the restaurant at the table of opportunity eating, and they look up and they see a sign that says open, they don't even recognize that there's a two-sided sign going on, because it is difficult for any of us to recognize a system of inequity that privileges us. So, for example, it is difficult for men to recognize male privilege and sexism. It's difficult for white Americans to recognize white privilege and racism. In fact, it's difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege in the global context, although we are living it very large right now with how much of the global supply of COVID-19 vaccine we have sequestered in this nation. Now, those on the outside are very well aware that there's a two-sided sign going on, because it proclaims closed to them, but they can look through the window and see people inside eating. So back inside the restaurant, to those who ask, is there really a two-sided sign? Does racism really exist? I say, I know it's hard for you to know when you only see open. In fact, that's part of your privilege, not to have to know. But once you do know, you can choose to act. So it's not a scary thing to name racism. It's actually an empowering thing to name racism. It doesn't even compel you to act, but it does equip you to act so that if you care about those on the other side of the sign, which is an if, but if you do, why you could even talk to the restaurant owner who is, after all, inside with you. And you could say, restaurant owner, there are hungry people outside. Why don't you open the door and let them come in? You'll make more money, and oh, the conversations we could have. Or maybe what you'll do is pass some food through the window. Or maybe you try to tear down that sign or break through the door, but at least what you won't be doing is sitting back saying, wonder why those people don't just come on in and sit down and eat. Because you'll understand something about the two-sided nature of that sign that proclaims open to you. So when I have just 5 or 6 minutes to equip a group of people with an image that will not only help them understand that racism exists, that racism is structuring two-sided or multi-sided signs in our society, that is creating a dual or multifaceted reality, but also help them communicate it. So I hope that you will remember the essence of that image or that story so that you can share it out. This is the story I tell. But let me also say, I have actually started on 2 separate occasions, a 3-hour conversation each time with the following question. How could people who were born inside the restaurant know something about the two-sided nature of that sign? And each time it was a 3-hour conversation because there are many, many ways to know. So I encourage you all to talk among yourselves with your family members, whatever, about that question. I have to tell you that I am heartened that more and more people these days who were born inside the restaurant and who just 2 years ago might have been sitting inside eating and saying, well, what do those people outside say? Black lives matter. Don't they know all lives matter? Are now actually proclaiming, yes, Black lives matter. More and more people who were born inside the restaurant are saying the word racism, putting together the phrase structural racism, systemic racism. This is heartening. But let me warn us that if we just say a thing, now naming racism, as I said, is very important. It's the first of my 3 tasks of my national campaign because you must name a problem in order to get any traction on starting to the solution, right? But if that's all we do, if all we do is put some kind of statement on our institutional websites or on our Facebook, or we tweet something out or on Instagram, whatever it is, if we just say a thing, the warning is that racism denial is so staunchly held in this nation, and it's so seductive that 6 months from now, we may forget why we said that thing. And we might fall back into what I describe as the sleepiness, the somnolence of racism denial. So we have to go beyond naming racism to action. We have to tear down the sign. And of course, racism is not just a sign. It's a sign, it's the door, it's a lock. There's a whole system going on. We need to dismantle the lock, take the door off the hinges, because once we start acting, we will not forget why we are acting. So now I've said the word racism a bunch of times. So now let me define it for you. And when I say the word racism, I am clear that I'm talking about a system. So I am not talking about an individual character flaw or a personal moral failing or even a psychiatric illness, as some people have suggested, even though, yes, it can show up in all of those ways. But in its essence, racism is a system of power. And a system of doing what? System of doing 2 things, of structuring opportunity and assigning value. And on what basis is the opportunity structured? And on what basis is the value assigned? It's based on so-called race, based on the social interpretation of how one looks, which is what we call race in this race-conscious society. What are the impacts of the system? Well, when people in this nation finally recognize that, yes, racism exists, then they usually recognize that it is unfairly disadvantaging some individuals and communities. But it shouldn't take any of us long to recognize that every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage, so that racism is also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities. That's the whole issue of unearned white privilege that we hardly ever talk about in this country because it makes some people, especially some people who are living as white, uncomfortable. And I used to, when I would recognize that discomfort rippling through an audience after I would start sharing this definition, I would say, well, you know, if any of you feel uncomfortable, shake it off, stay with me. I'm going to tell you more stories. I would almost apologize for the discomfort. I don't do that anymore. Now, what I say is, if you feel uncomfortable acknowledging the reality of unearned white privilege in this nation, I want you to lean into that discomfort, because I have come to recognize that for all of us, the edge of our comfort is actually our growing edge. But there's a third impact of racism that many of us miss, and that is that racism is sapping the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. So when we don't vigorously invest in the excellent full education of public education of all of our children, or when we are complacent with the wholesale warehousing disproportionately of so many Black and brown men in our prison system, or so many examples of this, we are cutting ourselves off from genius, from leadership, from creativity, from generosity, love. We are sapping the strength of the whole society when we undervalue or even dehumanize so many of us and structure opportunities so that people cannot live to their full potential. I actually think that that third impact of racism, so you have the three: unfair disadvantage, reciprocal unfair advantage, how it saps the strength of the whole society. I think that's the one we need to lift up most urgently these days and these times. We need more media stories about that. More conversations around our faculty tables or our boardroom tables or our dinner tables, right? We need more people filled with a sense of urgency to dismantle this system and put in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to their full potentials. Now, I know I'm eating some of my precious time, but I just want to say one thing. Through an interaction that I had at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, where I was told I needed to take that unfairly advantages point off of my slide, or maybe after 3 or 4 weeks of we tussling back and forth, maybe if I said unfairly, if I took the unfairly off of disadvantage and advantage, maybe I can acknowledge the advantage. That taught me a lot. And what it taught me is that it wasn't just that one person who was in charge of clearing my slides, but there are many people in this nation who would acknowledge that there are two states of being, but they would describe them as disadvantaged and normal. And the reason that many people in this country would describe the two states of being as disadvantaged and normal is that we as a nation are ahistorical. We act as if the present were disconnected from the past, and as if the current distribution of advantage and disadvantage were just a happenstance. The people do not recognize that their so-called normal is built up on a whole mountain of unfair advantage. So now, in order to understand how this system can manifest its health outcomes, differences in the numbers of our babies dying before their first birthday, the infant mortality rate differences by so-called race, or maternal mortality rate differences, 3 times as many Black women, and even more, 3 to 8 times as many Indigenous women dying in childbirth or within a year of pregnancy compared to white women. How is racism turning into that? How is it turning into the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color, or, you know, diabetes and the like? So I have distilled now for more than 2 decades 3 levels of racism: institutionalized or structural, personally mediated, which some would call interpersonal, but I am so clear that racism is a system that I call this level personally mediated because it's the system mediated through people, and internalized. So I want to just very briefly, if I can, define each of these levels, give you examples of how they impact health, and then illustrate them with another one of my allegories based on my own real life experience. So the first level, institutionalized or structural, is actually this system. It is the constellation of structures, policies, practices, norms, and values that put together result in differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. This is the kind of racism that doesn't require an identifiable perpetrator because it's been institutionalized in our laws and customs and background norms. This is the kind of racism that shows up as inherited disadvantage or its reciprocal inherited advantage. And we see it both in terms of material conditions and in terms of access to power. So examples include differential access by race to excellent housing, opportunities or quality educational opportunities, equal employment, even the same level of income at the same level of employment. And clearly those things impact health. Differential access to medical facilities, including physical access and the closing of hospitals, different places, financial access, linguistic access, differential access to a clean environment, and the very well documented disproportionate placement of toxic dump sites or bus transfer stations in communities of color. And with regard to access to power, that could be manifest as differential access to information, including COVID-19 information, or how do you get a vaccine, or information about our own histories. Differential access to power as resources, not just capital resources, but social networking resources, knowing somebody on the board, and differential access to power as voice in media, voice in government, and the many across this nation, the many state legislatures that are trying to further impede voice of some communities differentially to government and the like. So sometimes when people see this list, they'll stop me and they'll say, look at that top list of examples: housing, education, employment, income. Dr. Jones, isn't that what we call social class? Dr. Jones, why do you have that on a slide about racism? Are you talking about racism, or are you really, really, really talking about social class? This is such an important question, and many of you might have this, that I'm going to answer it briefly if I can. The first part of my answer is the observation that it doesn't just so happen that people of color in this country are overrepresented in poverty, while white people in this country are overrepresented in wealth. That's not just a happenstance. And for each marginalized or stigmatized or oppressed group of color, there's been some initial historical injustice. So for example, for Indigenous North Americans, for American Indians, the initial historical injustice was the taking of the land, and then the near genocide, and then the moving of survivors to reserved lands, reservations, and then in some instances, something good was found under one reservation. Oops, you got to pick the people up and move them someplace else. There are families that lived for centuries in Mexico and never crossed the border. But the border crossed them. They find themselves in New Mexico, in Texas, Arizona, California, and their great-great-grandchildren are still being harassed and vilified and targeted in the El Paso massacre now more than 2 years ago, and the like. There were Chinese laborers brought here to help us build our railroad system, but then in the 1880s, the Chinese Exclusion Act and other laws, unable by law to bring their families here, unable by law to marry. There were Japanese Americans interned during World War II when German Americans or Italian Americans weren't treated in that way. And for people of African descent, the initial historical injustice was the kidnapping of West African people, our importation across the Atlantic, the tremendous loss of life in the Middle Passage. And then for the survivors and their progeny for generations and generations, what I describe as the coerced usury of our unpaid labor for centuries to build this country. But then people hear me talking like that and they're like, oh, Dr. Jones, there you go talking about slavery. Dr. Jones, we all recognize that slavery was an unfortunate chapter in our nation's history. But Dr. Jones, the enslaved people were emancipated by 1865. That makes it now 157 years ago. So Dr. Jones, all else being equal, don't you think the impacts of slavery would have washed out by now? Well, the answer to the question is in the question, isn't it? All else being equal. All else has not been equal since 1865. All else still is not equal today. There are what I describe as present day contemporary structural factors that are perpetuating that and all of these other initial historical injustices that I've described. And these contemporary structural factors are part and parcel of institutionalized or structural racism. So when you ask me, am I talking about racism or am I really talking about social class? My response is that structural racism explains why we even see an association between social class and race in this country. It is not just a happenstance. And I could go so much more deeply in here. Somebody can ask me, about, anti-poverty versus anti-racism interventions. I'd love to go there. I will just say that this level of racism can be through acts of doing, acts of commission, as well as acts of not doing, acts of omission. And very often it shows up as lack of action, inaction in the face of need. The second level of racism, personally mediated racism, I define as differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race, and then differential actions, based on those assumptions. Now, this is what most people think of when they hear the word racism. Somebody did something to somebody. It includes the different idea, the prejudice, and the different action, the discrimination. And it manifests in many ways: police brutality, physician disrespect. I just have to pick this up. That physician disrespect can be manifest. It can be as subtle as a physician, us, not giving a patient the full range of treatment options because we assume that that patient couldn't afford, wouldn't understand, wouldn't comply anyway, or whatever it is we assume. Or it could be as blatant as sterilization abuse, which has had many iterations in our nation's history. Shopkeeper vigilance, being followed around in stores, waiter indifference, not getting quick, respectful treatment. These are just two of the many manifestations of what some people call everyday racism, the microaggressions, the subtle communication of disrespect, which may even underlie elevated blood pressures in communities of color, blood pressures that don't even go down at night. Teacher devaluation. If a teacher looks at a young child and thinks that child can't learn and puts them off in the attention deficit disorder track, right? That child will never even know their full potential, much less have the opportunity to develop to their full potential. This level, like institutionalized or structural, can be through acts of doing, acts of commission, as well as acts of not doing, acts of omission. But even more important here is that this level can be unintentional as well as intentional. You do not have to have intended to do something racist to have had a racist impact. The third level of racism, internalized racism, I used to for years only describe it from the point of view of members of stigmatized races, where I define it as acceptance by members of stigmatized races of negative messages about our own abilities and intrinsic worth. But I also agreed with many of my colleagues who said, well, Kamara, what about the internalized sense of entitlement that many white people walk around with? Isn't that also internalized racism? So yes, so now I include that on my slide. For members of structurally advantaged races, that sense of entitlement is a manifestation of internalized racism, which also then results in racism denial. Because if you feel entitled to this positionality, then you have to deny that there is a system, an unfair system going on. But the rest of my definition is still going to refer to the impacts of this level of racism on health for those of us who've been stigmatized, because for the longest, actually, I can't think of how a sense of entitlement could lead to bad health outcomes, except if you have a sense of entitlement thwarted. Now, if you have a sense of entitlement thwarted, maybe that is at the root of what some people are describing as the diseases of despair in white populations. So, the suicides, the opioid epidemic and the like. But for members of stigmatized races, internalized racism shows up as self-devaluation, feeling maybe I'm really not as good as. Maybe I shouldn't try to graduate from high school or apply to that college or try to get that job or live in that neighborhood. It shows up as the white man's ice is colder syndrome, where that phraseology came to me through my parents and their generation, and what it meant then for people of color, it means for many of us today. So say I'm Black and I need a lawyer, I might actually seek out a white lawyer over a Black lawyer. Or if I were sick, I might prefer the white doctor over the Black doctor. If I could find a Black doctor. And I'm not saying this to say that racism is about a white-Black duality. I'm not, it's for all of us, as I've been clear in my conversations, but for me, from my Blackness, this is the duality that I'm describing. If my lemonade were warm, I might go way down the street to get the white man's ice over the Black man's ice, deeply believing that the white man's ice is colder, deeply internalizing the myth of white superiority. It actually is about members of stigmatized races accepting the limitations to our own full humanity of the box into which we've been placed. So now I would like to share with you my Gardener's Tale allegory, which is another of my allegories. And I'm going to stop sharing for a while so that you guys can see me big. I know I've been using my hands a lot already, but part of this story is really going to require a lot of my hands. So this is going to help us understand these three levels of racism, contextualize them one with the other, and then give us an idea of what do we need to do to go forward. So let me first tell you what happened in my own real life, and then I'm going to make it a story about racism. So my husband and I had been married for about 1 year when we moved down to Baltimore for me to finish my PhD at Hopkins. And we bought our first freestanding house, cute little house, big wraparound porch with flower boxes dotted all on the porch. Now, we bought this house in October, which was really not the time to plant in Baltimore, so we waited. But when spring came, my husband, who loves to garden, he ran out onto our porch with our marigold seed, got to decorate our cute little house, right? And then he came right back in and he said, Kamara, Some of these boxes have dirt in them, but some of the boxes are empty. So I need to go to the gardening store. So he does, goes down to the gardening store, comes back hauling big old bags of potting soil, right? And then we fill up those empty boxes. Then we take equal numbers of the marigold seeds and put them in all of the boxes, and we water all of the boxes equally. And by this time, I, who am not the gardener in the family, by this time I'm exhausted. So I figure I'm just going to sit back and be delighted. So 3 weeks later, I walk out of my front door onto my porch, and I finally pay attention to these flower boxes. And what I saw made me literally stop in my tracks. Because what I saw made me think we had planted completely different species in some boxes versus others, because some of the boxes were full of plants, and the plants were tall and vigorous looking. But some of the boxes just had a few plants in them, and they were kind of scrawny and scraggly looking. And then I realized what had happened. That potting soil that my husband had bought turned out to be rich, fertile soil, so that every single seed planted in the rich, fertile soil had sprouted. The strong seed had grown very tall and vigorous, and even the weak seed had made it halfway up. But that old soil that we had found there turned out to be poor, rocky soil. So the weak seed planted in the poor, rocky soil just died. And even the strong seed in the poor, rocky soil had to struggle to make it to a middling height. And some of you might be nodding now because maybe you're gardeners. Maybe you've composted half of your garden. Maybe you've seen this image with your own real eyes. And of course, the image is about the importance of the soil, the importance of the environment. But now I'm going to make this a story about racism by introducing a gardener. So now we have a gardener who has 2 flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil, one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil, and she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the seed is going to produce pink blossoms, and some of the seed is going to produce red blossoms, and the gardener prefers red over pink. So what does she do? She takes the red seed, puts it in the rich, fertile soil, pink seed in the poor, rocky soil. 3 weeks later, in her flower boxes, she sees what I saw in mine. In that rich, fertile soil, all the red seed sprouts, strong red seed, tall and vigorous, weak red seed makes it halfway up. In the poor rocky soil, weak pink seed dies. Here comes a strong pink seed, struggling to make it to a middling height. And then in those flower boxes, those flowers go to seed. And the next year, the same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And year after year, the same thing happens until finally, about 10 years later, the gardener's looking at her flower boxes and she says, you know, I was right to prefer red over pink. So we're going to interrupt the story there to say the first part of this story is how structural or institutionalized racism works. We had the initial historical injustice of the separation of the seed into the 2 types of soil, the contemporary structural factors of the flower boxes keeping the soil separate, and then through lack of action, inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of the inequity. But let's pick the story back up and say, well, where is personally mediated racism in this garden? Well, the gardener's looking at the red flowers thinking red is beautiful and loving red. And then she looks at the pink flowers and she says, oh, those pink flowers sure are scrawny and scraggly. So she plucks off the pink blossoms before they can even go to seed. Or maybe she notices that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil. So she plucks it out before it can establish itself, which is some of the anti-affirmative action stuff that goes on. And where would internalized racism be in the garden? Well, the red flowers are just living their lives, enjoying being red, many of them not acknowledging or maybe even recognizing that they're benefiting from enriched soil. The pink flowers are looking over at red, thinking red is mighty fine and wishing with all their hearts that they too could be red. And here come the bees minding their own business, collecting nectar at the same time. So here comes, and collecting nectar and pollinating. So here comes a bee into one of the pink flowers and to another pink flower and to this pink flower. And this flower's like, get away from me, bee. Don't bring me any of that pink pollen. I prefer the red, because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So now the question arises, what do we do to set things right in this garden? Well, we could start by addressing the internalized racism. We could go over to the pink flowers and we could say, pink is beautiful, power to the pink. And that is an important intervention. But if that is all we do, it is not going to change the situation in which the pink flowers find themselves. So you say, oh, okay, let's address the personally mediated racism. Let's have a conversation with the gardener, or better yet, let's have what we do. And in the workshop, we say, dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink flowers? And maybe she will, maybe she won't. But even if she does, it's not going to change the situation in which they find themselves. If we really want to set things right in this garden, we must address the structural racism, which means we have to break down the boxes and mix up the soil. Or if you want to keep separate boxes, that's all right too, although it does make it easier for that same gardener to keep segregating resources going forward. But if it's important to keep separate boxes, then if you want to set things right, you need to enrich the poor rocky soil until it is as rich as the rich fertile soil. And when you do that, the pink flowers will flourish. They'll be looking beautiful, grand, and glorious. So that in that intervention on the structural racism, you'll also have addressed the internalized racism, because pink will no longer be looking over at red, thinking red is better, or wanting to be red. And in the intervention of the structural, you may also address the personally mediated racism. Now, the original gardener may have to go to her grave preferring red over pink, but her children who grow up and see the flowers looking equally beautiful will be less likely to have that idea. So this story has been to illustrate these three levels of racism, to strongly suggest that if we want to set things right in the garden, we need to at least address the structural. Good to address all the levels at the same time, but at least address the structural. And when we do, the other levels may take care of themselves. But there's another question before I leave the story, which I haven't answered yet, which is, who is the gardener? After all, the gardener is the one that I gave the power to decide, the power to act, and control of resources, which are actually the elements of self-determination. In our setting, who is the gardener? Well, government is a huge part of the gardener, but not the only part. Media, foundations, corporations, health systems, communities to the extent they have self-determination. But whoever the gardener is, it is dangerous when the gardener is allied with one group. I painted her red. That's why she prefers red over pink. And it's also dangerous when she's not concerned with equity, when she can look at her flower boxes and she looks at them and she thinks her garden is beautiful, thank you, because she's not even counting the pink flowers as part of her garden. So now we have to ask, what do we do about the gardener? Do we make the gardener striped or polka dotted or fuchsia? Do the pink flowers have to grow or recruit their own gardener? Many questions can come out of this story. And I again encourage you to you can hear it again if you want to just Google it. But to share this story on, I want to share with you two questions that have come up before, and then I'm going to race through the rest of my tools that I have for you. One question that I was asked many years ago, I still share all the time, and that is, excuse me, Dr. Jones, but why should the red flowers share their soil? When I heard that question, I loved the question because it showed me the power of this story to start conversations on racism that might be otherwise difficult if we were talking about racism between you and me. My answer to the question, why should the red flowers share their soil, is that actually that soil doesn't belong to the red flowers, it belongs to the whole garden. The second question is, what if that's not the original gardener we're looking at? What if that's the gardener's great-great-great-great-grandchild? Because here we are. And the great-great-great-great-grandchild has always seen the flowers looking like that, may not even think there's a problem to be solved. So in 3 quick steps, the first thing is we must make the differences in the height and vigor of the pink and red flowers a problem requiring urgent solution. We must put that on our urgent action agenda. We must be about anti-racism, right? But then, so now we have it on the agenda, but what do? Part 2 is we must make the flower boxes transparent. We must be talking about the differences in the quality of the soil if we're going to be able to address those differences. But the third part is that as we make those flower boxes transparent, we also need to make sure that everybody understands that the pink seed did not just go launch themselves into that poor rocky soil. So we must talk about history, yes. And we also must talk about how the gardener's initial preference for red over pink set up the whole situation, which some people might call cultural racism, which in our setting is clearly white supremacist ideology. Because if we do not, even if we were to compel that red gardener to enrich the poor rocky soil today until it was as rich as the rich fertile soil today, if she continues to prefer red over pink, she will continue to privilege red over pink going forward. So when I describe racism as a system of doing two things, structuring opportunity and assigning value, we actually need to address both, the opportunity structures and the value assignment, if we're going to set things right. Here's the third allegory that I want to share with you. This one is to help us understand the second of the 4 key messages. I said racism exists, racism is a system. So when I say cement dust in this allegory, I want you to think cement dust. And I also want you to think racism. So imagine that there's a cement factory spewing cement dust, and the cement dust fills the air. And if any of us are anywhere around this factory for any amount of time, we're going to get cement dust in our lungs. And the cement dust in our lungs is problematic for all of us, even though it might affect different ones of us differently. Cement dust in my lungs might make me feel that I'm less than. Cement dust in somebody else's lungs might make him feel that he can, with equanimity, crush the life out of another human being with his knee for 9 minutes and 29 seconds. But whatever, the cement dust in our lungs is problematic, even for those who don't recognize they have cement dust in their lungs, and even for the cement factory owner who might want to trade off a little cement dust for profit. But anyway, recognizing this now, what are we going to do? Do we focus on the individual? Well, let me say that already, I'm going to tell you, I don't highly recommend this first strategy, but what might it look like? If we were to focus on the individual, would we have some kind of machine that would screen people for how much cement dust they have in their lungs? And then if they found somebody with too much dust, some kind of alarm would go off. Well, then what would we do? We put them on the edge of society, vote them off the island? This is not a useful intervention. And honestly, it might be useful only if the person is interested in how much cement dust they have in their lungs, right? But this kind of intervention actually makes many people not want to talk about cement dust at all. Here, I'm going to go straight to the racism analogy of it. Sometimes people don't even want to say the word racism or hear because they think that when you say the word racism, you are trying to divide the room up into who's racist and who's not, or peer deeply into their soul to figure out exactly how racist they are. So I don't think that this is a good strategy. But what if there's somebody who recognizes they have cement dust in their lungs and they want to do something about it? Well, maybe we could set up cleansing spas, and people who are interested, or people could be encouraged to go into the cleansing spa and get all clean, start reading history, meeting people, talking to people, walking in other people's shoes. But as soon as they come back out into that same cloud of dust, then the dust is going to reaccumulate in their lungs. So it's not a very permanent solution unless people start living in the cleansing spa. So what does that mean? Do we need to acknowledge the cloud? Well, what would that look like? Well, at least I would recognize that I wasn't born with cement dust in my lungs, that I have cement dust in my lungs because of the cloud of dust all around me. And recognizing that might make me think of a more durable solution. Maybe I'll put on a gas mask, right? To filter out the dust, to keep more dust from accumulating in my lungs, even though I recognize that it won't take out the dust that was already there. But this solution is really good. I'm going to have to keep the mask on 24/7. It's going to be starting my own individual anti-cement dust journey, right? And when you see me with a gas mask, then you're going to say, Dr. Jones, why are you wearing a gas mask? And I'll say, well, we're in this cloud of cement dust. So I'm going to name this aspect of racism. And more of you might decide to put on gas masks. So is that the answer then? We just need to have 330 million gas masks, little baby gas masks and old people gas masks. Well, that's a good start. You know, all of us starting on our individual anti-racism journeys. But I think that is not the final. This is not really the best that we can do. I think what we really need to do is dismantle the factory. So especially those of us who have started our individual anti-racism journeys, but all of us need to move closer to the factory, try to eat. You know, the factory has been obscured by all the dust that it has put up. Some people may not even recognize there's a factory in there. But we who have been studying and who have clearer eyes because of our gas masks need to go there. And we need to ask, how is this factory operating here? And then we need to organize and strategize to act to dismantle the factory and to put in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to their full potentials. So in this story, it's not only that racism is a system, but that we must address racism at the systems level if we're really going to get traction on unraveling this problem. So I put that question, how is the cement factory operating here? That's the question, how is racism operating here? Which is really a legitimate question because racism is not a cloud or a miasma we can't get a handle on. It is a system with identifiable and addressable mechanisms in our structures, policies, practices, norms, and values, right? And when I said structures, policies, practices, norms, and values, I might have given you a headache until we recognize that these are actually the elements of decision-making. Structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, especially who's at the table, who's not, what's on the agenda, and what's not. Policies are the written how of decision-making. Practices and norms are the unwritten how of decision-making. Practices, how we do things every day. Norms, how we're expected to do things and how we've always done things. Values are the why. And if we take this question, how is racism operating here with us? how is it operating here in my child's daycare or in my workplace, or with regard to police killings of unarmed Black and brown men and women, or with regard to the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color. Thinking about the who's at the table, who's not, the what, when, where, how, why of decision making, we can, within 5, 10, 15 minutes, generate 5, 10, 15 possible early levers for intervention. And then what we need to do is to organize and strategize to act around those. I knew I was not going to have time to give you an example of how we can answer that question, but that's a question that actually, if each department or each person trying to solve a problem just sat with that for a minute, could actually start identifying targets for action. I want to breeze through this definition of health equity, a 3-part definition, my 3-part definition. What is it? How do we get there? How is it related to health disparities? Where health equity I define as assurance of the conditions for optimal health for all people. It's a process, not an outcome. But process assurance, which is one of the 3 core functions of public health identified by the Institute of Medicine decades ago, along with assessment and policy development of what of the conditions for optimal health, the social determinants of health for whom, for all people. That's what makes it equity. How do we get there? Well, achieving health equity requires at least these 3 things: valuing all individuals and populations equally, recognizing and rectifying historical injustices, and providing resources according to need. And then the 3rd part of the definition, how is health equity related to health disparities? Health disparities will be eliminated when health equity is achieved. The disparities are the differences in the height and vigor of the pink and red flowers. The equity or inequity is about the quality of the soil, the separation, the watering, the inattention, all of that. So one is outcomes, the others are opportunity structures. And if you want to figure out, is my work forwarding health equity, you have to ask, are you doing these 3 things? And if you want to ask me how to operationalize those, I'd be happy to do so. I have identified 7 barriers to achieving health equity. So I'm going to just race through them right now. The first, our narrow focus on the individual makes systems and structures either invisible or seemingly irrelevant. The second, our ahistorical stance makes, we act as if the present were disconnected from the past, and as if the current distribution of advantage and disadvantage were just a happenstance. We are seeing that in a lot of these anti-critical race theory efforts right now. They really aren't about anti-critical race theory. Nobody's teaching critical race theory in elementary, junior high, high school, college. None of it. It's a legal theory, but they're anti-naming racism, anti-talking about equity or social justice, anti-learning history. The myth of meritocracy, this endorsement of the story that goes like this: if you work hard, you will make it. Now I give you, most people who have made it have worked hard. Not everybody who has made it has worked hard. We have prominent examples of that, but most people who have made it have worked hard. But there are many other people working just as hard or harder who will never make it because of an uneven playing field, which has been structured and is being perpetuated by racism, sexism, heterosexism. All of these systems of structured inequity. You can ask me how they're all related to one another. When we deny the existence of these systems, then we blame those who haven't made it for being lazy or stupid. And many ways to deny racism. One is to say, I don't think racism exists, but the other is to be working about disproportionalities, disparities, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, structural competence, structural humility, all of this, and never say the word racism, because if we do not say the word racism in our national context of widespread racism denial, we're complicit with that denial. The 4th of the 7 barriers to achieving health equity is this myth of a zero-sum game. If you gain, I lose, which sets us up in competition over cooperation. It's like I'm sitting at a potluck dinner table. I see you coming. I don't want you anywhere near this table because I think you're just going to come eat up all the food. I can't even recognize that you're bringing all kinds of cakes and pies and roasts and salads and fruits with you. The 5th of these barriers is our limited future orientation in the general culture of this nation, where the parts of the future that each of us can touch today that will hopefully survive us are the children and the planet. We have a disregard for the children and a usurious relationship with the planet. We are not like many American Indian nations with a 7 generations perspective in our decision-making. We are not like the Maasai people of West Africa who greet one another, not with, hey, how you doing, but with the question, how are the children? Hoping to hear back the answer, all the children are well. In this country, we don't even ask how are the children. And if we did, we would not get the answer, all the children are well. The 6th of the 7 barriers is our endorsement of the myth of American exceptionalism, that we're so special, so different, so ordained by God, that of course we're entitled to all this vaccine that we have in this country right now, when many other countries, most of the population hasn't even gotten the first shot. And it also makes us disinterested in learning from other nations. The seventh is the first, actually. This is the foundational value thing underlying racism, white supremacist ideology. I don't say it as a lightning rod term. I am describing the false idea of a hierarchy of human valuation. There is no such hierarchy. The falser notion, not only that there is one, but that white people would be at the top as the ideal or the norm, but that gives many people who are living as white in this country a sense of entitlement. It results in the devaluation and indeed dehumanization of people of color and fear at the browning of America that is underlying a lot of our political divide today. So what can we do today? Going back to that image from the dual reality, we need to actively look for evidence of two-sided signs. Is there something differential going on here by race, by gender, by immigration status, by language, by zip code, by urban, rural, by religion? Looking not only at outcomes, but also at opportunity structures. We need to burst through our bubbles of experience to experience our common humanity on the other side of town. Each of us is in a bubble of experience. Most of us do not know that just across town, there are people who are just as kind, funny, generous, hardworking, smart as we are. We're living in very different circumstances. At the individual and institutional levels, we need to create bubble bursting opportunities so we can experience our common humanity in different circumstances and start building common cause. We need to be interested in the stories of others, believe the stories of others, and then join in the stories of others. More of us are doing that these days. We need to develop a sensitivity to the absence of who is not at the table, what is not on the agenda, what policies are not in place that are put in place with bring us more social justice. We need to reveal inaction in the face of need because that's how structural racism very often shows up these days. But all the power is not on the part of those inside the restaurant. Those of us on the outside need to know our power. We need to know that action is power, and especially that collective action is power, because collective action will inform us, inspire us, protect us, propel us. So now I hope I've left a little time for your questions. I know I was talking so fast, but I had so many ideas that I wanted to share with you. And so here we are. And yes, I left a little bit of time.
Thank you, Kamara. That was terrific and inspiring. Some good questions have come in. Let me start with one or two of my own. Given how remarkable the last couple of years, both in the issues of COVID and racial justice, I know you've been focused on this issue for decades and thought about it and given many, many talks. How is your approach to it different today than it was 2 years ago?
I'm being invited a lot more places.
There's that.
So I'm learning a lot more through interactions with people. My approach is the same. I have many new allegories. I'm always developing new tools because my superpower, I think, is my ability to take complex ideas and to make them in images where people can remember them. And 10 years from now, 10 years, people who heard me 10 years ago come up and say, oh, I still remember the pink and red roses. They were never roses, but everybody says the pink and red roses. So I'm not dealing with it differently. I'm just dealing with it more often.
Mm-hmm. And it is January 6th. How do you reflect on that day and what happened a year ago through the lens that you bring to all of us?
I think that it's the last thing I said, that I think that people who really believe in white supremacist ideology feel threatened. And so there are people I know who really do believe that there is a hierarchy of human valuation. They really do believe that white people are smarter, better, whatever, safer, everything. And as the nation browns, they feel threatened. And they also were goaded on by somebody who doesn't value them, but who holds up the white supremacist flag for them. I mean, so I think that it's a sign of us not knowing each other, that we have become so, even in our news bubbles, so sequestered from one another. And I wish that we could do more bubble bursting in community ways. And I wish that we could really understand our common humanity, but we are so separated, even in what we believe to be truth. I'm frightened. So what do I think? I think it's a result of white supremacist ideology being fanned, the flames being fanned for somebody's private power thing, and recognizing that it existed, right? And bringing it up out of the closets. And and all, and it's scary. I'm frightened.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. A couple of questions I think that relate to you being here and seeing what we are and what we're not. So let me start with Eddie Mockinger, who asked, to me, our health system's efforts to achieve health equity are achieved, at least in part, through clinical care. And we are having a hard time providing primary care to the community. The primary care practice is short-staffed and it's pretty hard to get in, and there's a capacity issue in primary care everywhere, but we are feeling it here. So how do we think about that as in terms of sort of getting to health equity, particularly when the primary care infrastructure is underdeveloped?
So I think that the three principles for achieving health equity, especially providing resources according to need, if that were really guiding us, then we would have to beseech, we would not, I know that I don't have the money in the purse strings and that there are many competing interests, but really we would, if we recognized, it goes to another, my cliff analogy and stuff, if we weren't going to be investing so much in ambulances at the bottom of the cliff, but if we were going to think more about investing in nets to catch people after they've fallen off the edge of the cliff, or fences to keep people from falling, or if we were going to invest more in community development to move the population away from the edge of the cliff, and if we were to acknowledge that we have a three-dimensional cliff going on with differential distribution of resources and populations, if we were to back up in the different levels of health intervention, we would recognize the importance, even in the clinical setting, of primary care, and we would start putting more of our resources there. Mm-hmm. So it takes a different understanding. Like, people tend to take their day job as the main thing without recognizing that they're part of a bigger system, and they need to value and support the other elements of the system. And I think that all of us as citizens, not national citizens, but global citizens, people concerned about the whole, need to first of all, to be concerned about the three-dimensionality of this cliff, and we need to be concerned about people being pushed closer to the edge and all of that. So realistically, though, more resources need to go into primary care. We can't just say, oh my God, we're limited. There has to be a partnership between those clinicians and the community. We need to make the institutional walls more porous so that there can be a better partnership to then move to where the resources can be allocated to push for that. So I think all of that. I could keep talking forever. I want to hear more questions.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. Anonymous said, thank you for the informative presentation. And maybe, I don't know if you've been around us long enough to know this, but asks what policies, pathways, systems are in place at UCSF to address issues of racism and hold colleagues accountable who engage in racist behaviors or in denial of their racism.
So I am meeting with lots of people. I would say that the main thing I would notice is that because UCSF is UCSF and it's in San Francisco and it's in California, a lot of people think, oh, well, and you have this anti-racism initiative and the medical school is working on an anti-oppression curriculum and all like that. Like, okay, we're good. And I think that what is missing is that we are in the United States of America, which is a racist country. Maybe you're a little further along, but there's always, this is going to be an immense process to make things right in the House and push back racism. We should never be thinking we're good at UCSF. The first year medical students, some of them made it clear that they thought UCSF was good. And then in one of their early classes, they were like, oh my God, what's going on here? Why, I don't know if you guys know about it, but why is our pain being used to teach our colleagues? And why isn't this course being geared to help us grow? Why is it being for the uninitiated white medical student geared there and not for people who have more lived experience or more insight or whatever? So I think that, and the pushback at UCSF is subtle. So maybe people have been overheard saying, well, I guess there's no place at UCSF for white men anymore. Like when people are heard saying that, there's this pushback. So UCSF has to recognize that their anti-racism struggle needs to be not a 1 year, 3 year, 5 year endeavor. This is going to be a generational endeavor that a lot of resources have to go into it, and that racism denial is real. And we need to be talking to each other more, and we need to be more open. That at the moment that people want to put on their individual gas mask, That's good to start the individual anti-racism journeys. And then when we have more and more of us, we need to dismantle the things in the system. But right now, people are a little bit like not wanting to talk about cement dust.
Mhm.
Some of them.
We only have a second left, or maybe 30 seconds. Just like I'll give it just a chance to. Is there anything that you've seen the last few years that makes you more hopeful than you were?
The number of people who were in the street after the very public gruesome murder of Mr. George Floyd, and in the street for so long. It took cell phone video documentation and so many of the other things, take body cam footage and stuff. And we need to be interested, believe, and join in the stories of others without requiring that kind of footage. But that gave me hope that what people have been saying in communities of color all along was finally, I guess, witnessed and believed. So that gave me hope. I just want to leave 4 things for those of you listening to me. I call them my 4 BCs. And so, and I think of these as habits of mind for social justice warriors. They're be courageous, be curious, be collective, and build community. Be courageous, speak your truth. Be curious, ask why and why and why again, ask serial whys and read widely and read history. Be collective, care about the whole, and then build community, go across town and stay a while, walk in somebody else's shoes and in their reality.
Perfect way to end. Thank you for helping to teach us and learn from us and inspire us. We really are grateful. Thank you to our colleagues in the Department of Pediatrics who co-sponsored this with us. And again, next week we will come back to a COVID session with Eric Topol. Everybody stay well and stay safe. Thanks so much.